Dr. Drilon.
Thanks very much for the invitation. It's really my pleasure to speak at this forum. I think that there are many themes that have been fleshed out in the last two talks, and I thought that I would use the 5 minutes that I was given to really kind of break things down and talk about the data in sort of simpler terms and maybe highlight things which can really affect patients who are on these therapies and talk about options for next generation therapies that may be available. So next slide, please. As you know, and as has been discussed, there are two targeted therapy pills approved for TRK fusion positive cancers. And when we say targeted therapy, that's different from older types of treatments like chemotherapy, which really have sort of a focus on breaking down cancer DNA regardless of what's driving the cancer. In this particular paradigm, you have the TRK proteins, the NTRK proteins that are the primary drivers of growth. And these pills or targeted therapies are called targeted therapies because they're really designed to zoom in and counter that particular mutant protein. And as has been discussed, two of these are already approved, not just within the United States, but across a wide variety of different regulatory environments. So as you've heard, larotrectinib and entrectinib, there are approvals going from adults all the way down to children and infants, particularly for larotrectinib, as you've heard from Dr. Leach. What are the differences between these two pills? Well, larotrectinib is a selective inhibitor, so it really zooms in and inhibits those TRK proteins that drive cancer. Entrectinib, on the other hand, inhibits other things apart from TRK. So you may have heard that the drug also has an approval for ROS1 dependent lung cancers. And that may be confusing for some, but certainly there are drugs such as this that are versatile in that they're able to inhibit several different genes that drive cancer. But as you can see in the balloon here below, with both drugs, we're achieving very good outcomes in patients. So high response rates that exceed 60 to 80%. And based on some of the latest presentations of the updated data with longer follow-up from when patients first started these pills, we certainly have patients who are almost pushing 4 years and still going. And as you may have seen, some of these plots where you have each patient presented on what's called a swimmer diagram, where the bars move horizontally. This patient that I'm talking about here is kind of at the topmost bar who's been going for a long time. And you've heard also from Dr. Leish, when you've seen those curves of patients, of children who have received a TRK inhibitor, and those seem to plateau, that tells us that many patients can stay on these pills for a very long time and keep their cancer under control. So the last thing I'll highlight is that for cancers which have a proclivity for going to the brain, or even for cancers that start in the brain, primary brain tumors, we've seen the activity of both of these drugs. And I think that's a win, not only for primary brain tumors that harbor these TRK fusions, but also for metastatic disease, where you want to make sure that you control all areas where cancer might spread. So next slide. The last two speakers have already talked about this, but the best diagnostic test, if you're asked, as long as there are no issues with insurance or payer coverage, is really next generation sequencing. And I'll add an extra element there and say that the data that we and others have really underscored about the best type of nucleic acid to use for these tests shows that you may have very good DNA-based next-generation sequencing tests, but even those tests may be suboptimal at finding a TRK fusion. And we found that if you then test some of those cancers using RNA, you might find a fusion, a TRK fusion that was missed by a very good DNA-based test. And so this is on everyone's radar, obviously. At our center at Sloan Kettering, what we're doing is in cases that test quote unquote negative off of a good DNA-based next generation sequencing test, those are then funneled into RNA testing. And we're able to find more patients who have these track fusions. And as you know, a lot of commercial vendors are also moving to incorporate RNA testing. But I think it's worth a discussion when you recommend tests to other patients who are looking for these track fusions. It's important to know that, especially for the cancers that may be highly enriched for this, that the provider shouldn't always stop at the DNA-based test and say, oh, well, we didn't find a fusion, let's move on. But it may be very useful to see if they can do RNA-based sequencing. And the last thing I'll say is that not every environment has coverage for a good next-generation sequencing test. And we have things like immunohistochemistry or IHC that's able to actually look for the protein encoded by the gene. And if that test is highly positive, then there may be a good chance that an NTRK fusion is sitting in that cancer. So next slide. All right, this is something I wanted to talk about because this is something that's well recognized by investigators who have given a lot of these TRK inhibitors, but isn't really on the radar for many other providers who have maybe encountered their very first NTRK patient and aren't familiar with these drugs. So the first bullet here is these drugs are both safe and well tolerated. So most patients are able to stay on the full or recommended dose by the FDA, but there certainly are side effects to watch out for. And this was published in a paper recently from Annals Oncology from our center, showing that there are unique side effects of these inhibitors, such as dizziness that can occasionally pop up. And patients tell me some of them, one of them, for example, couldn't really play golf very well because he would get very dizzy every time he swings his club. Or another patient of mine who works in the garden and turns her head, often to kind of weed the garden. Those things have become much more difficult because these pills can affect balance and the sensation of where you are in space, and also control the pathways that are responsible for things like vertigo. So that's something to watch out for. Another thing is that in the first or second month, patients might say that they get very sensitive skin. It almost seems like a sunburn. And that might be accompanied by kind of pins and needles that occur around the mouth. In general, those things may be calmed down by nerve sensitivity reducing medications like gabapentin. But for many of our patients, these tend to go away after the first month and tend to cool down on their own even without therapy. The third thing is something that can sneak up on you. And the TRK pathway controls really the centers for appetite and thirst. And we know that especially in patients who are on these pills for a very, very long time, that weight gain can become problematic. I'm sure Dr. Leish will also tell you that we've seen weight gain in the pediatric population. And it's not something that we're always on the lookout for. For many other cancer therapies, we're always watching for weight loss. But here, especially if you've been on a pill for months or years, it's important to monitor the weight at least once a month and make sure that you keep an eye on that. What are the things that we can do for this? There are certainly weight loss medications that can be used to supplement diet or exercise. But sometimes we might need to lower the dose of the pill, as we might do for the dizziness, for example, to really try to attenuate that side effect. And the last bullet here is something also that we published in that paper that not many people were aware of. But because these pills change your threshold for feeling pain, when you come off of them, either temporarily for maybe a surgical procedure or radiation, or permanently because you have to switch to another cancer treatment, many patients experience really diffuse body pains, muscle aches, and that's because you kind of take your foot off of the brakes, and you're much more sensitive to pain. And I think that we need to get the word out that, especially when you're getting commercial supply, a script from your provider is how you got one of these pills and you're not on trial. that maybe lowering the dose sequentially or trying to titrate down the dose over time really helps to decrease the likelihood of feeling these full body pains or muscle aches. Another thing I've heard from patients is that in those, for example, that are taking these pills twice a day, you can almost feel when it's time for you to take the pill, because your body gets a little achy, and that's because of the fact that the drug levels from the last time you took the pill have kind of waned, and that's indicative of maybe more sensitivity to developing something like a pain flare when these drugs are stopped. So things in addition to titrating down the dose obviously are taking pain medication to support you through a period like that. Next slide, please. And we're almost at the end here. It's been mentioned that there certainly is hope in the research field, and there already are next generation pills that are in clinical trials. These are selitrectinib and repotrectinib, formerly called LOXO 195 or TPX0005. So what happens here is there in orange, you have an FDA approved first pill. At the onset of resistance, I think it's very important to look again at the genes of the cancer and see how the cancer has learned to outsmart these first generation pills. And what we've learned is sometimes the cancer learns how to outsmart larotrectinib or entrectinib by acquiring a new mutation in NTRK that these second generation pills were very uniquely designed to attack. And so I think that often what happens is that we may pay attention to doing sequencing at the very beginning to diagnose a cancer, but we don't often look at the genes again at resistance. And it's important to bring that back to your doctor, to bring back to your provider taking care of you, to say, can we look again and do a biopsy or look at a liquid biopsy? Because if you find one of these mutations, there may be a higher likelihood of your cancer responding to these next generation pills that are in many cancer centers on clinical trials around the globe. So to end, we'll go to the last slide and just really underscore the fact that there's a lot of hope in the NTRK space. Certainly our center, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, has prided ourselves on being a center of excellence for NTRK. We have a lot of the diagnostic experts that have published papers on how to best pick up these fusions. We have scientists that have taken a very deep dive into understanding cancer biology and resistance to these first generation pills. And beyond the second gen drugs that you saw in the last slide, some of our research has exposed newer treatment strategies, maybe doing combinations of two different pills, adding on a second pill to the larotrectinib or entrectinib for a certain gene signature. So when in doubt, you have the fantastic resource of the NTRKers that are able to help point you in our direction to provide some guidance if you're at that juncture where you're looking for something new. And with that, thank you very much for your attention. I think I've taken much more time than I was given, but I'd be happy to answer questions during the forum.